This is Rob Temmert for Boxing News. Delighted to be joined, it's been a while, but joined by Stephen Espinoza. We are here in Fight Week in Las Vegas for Canelo versus Munguia. Stephen, always a pleasure. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Look, a lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about indeed. Let's start talking about yourself. Last time I saw you was September, back end of last year, Canelo Charlo. Obviously, quite a lot has changed in your world since then. It's the first time that we've caught up since. What have you been up to, Stephen?
Well, adjustment, obviously, Showtime ended, went out with a bang and a great year. And since then, PBC moved their rights over to Amazon Prime. And one of the big changes for them is they have to do production, much the way that UFC handles their own production and MLS and other sports in the new sort of technology and new media world handle their own production. PBC was in the position of having to have their own production infrastructure. So they've asked me to supervise TV production. So from the live TV production to the gloves off, the shoulder programming, I'm supervising that, sort of similar to some of the responsibilities I had at Showtime.
In that role now, obviously with Amazon Prime, I mean, it sounds strange to say Amazon Prime being a new business in boxing, but they are very much so the new business in boxing. How does that differ from Showtime Boxing, which was incredibly established and had such a rich history in the sport?
It's a great question because and it's something we could spend all day on, because I think what we found collectively is that after 37 years in the sport, and speaking of Showtime, the network had assumed a lot of different responsibilities beyond just putting fights on TV, whether it's a social media infrastructure or helping with PR or helping with marketing. And sort of that is all gone. So I think there were more holes to plug than I think everyone ever expected. So it's a change, it's a learning process for PBC, it's a learning process for Amazon Prime. But notably, they've been very, very successful in Japan with the Nuye. That's Amazon Prime is his deal, and it's a very healthy deal at that. So they're not new to combat sports. Obviously, it's the first time they've really carried boxing, to this extent in the U.S. A big opportunity, but it's a learning and a growing process on both sides.
Seemingly every time we speak, we talk about kind of a shift in landscape with the boxing industry, and it is an ever-evolving industry. Just where it is now, when you consider the big events that are going on in Saudi Arabia, Amazon Prime now being involved in the sport, where does the industry stand at the minute? How excited should we be as obviously boxing fans about the future of the sport?
Well, it's interesting. I think if we go back, every time we've spoken over the last 5 or 6 years, I've said, look, tremendous change. And I might even said, look, it's more change now than any point. I still say this at this day. I mean, 5 years ago, we thought things were changing because of streaming. And it was a change, and it's still a change that's reverberating today. But now we've come to the point where, HBO's out, Showtime's out, streamers are, in. We've gone through a wave of DAZN coming in and adjusting, their strategy. Others have come in and out. We've now seen Saudi investment in the sport like nothing else. We've seen platforms like Overtime and others that, are new methods of distributing. I think this is a fantastic time for the sport. I think there's a real opportunity for the sport to reset and to figure out, hopefully, a cohesive way for the ecosystem to work, and to not get some of the bad habits. Maybe I'm naive thinking that we're going to figure it out this time, but I think it's exciting. There's still plenty of money. There's plenty of opportunity in the sport. There's plenty of need in the sport. I think there are still some holes in the ecosystem that I think need to be plugged in order for fighters to develop from pro debut up through pay-per-view. But I am excited that we have the opportunity to reach more fans more easily than any before. It's really a critical time for the sport that we take advantage of it.
That cohesive ecosystem, which is, it's a lovely thought, as we all know in boxing. Not every lovely
cohesive thing. Anything in boxing is a lovely thought.
Absolutely, but it does seem as though there has been. Obviously, a good example is the Saudi investment into the sport. We've seen, from our neck of the woods, Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren sat across from each other. We've seen. I saw the August 3rd announcement, and the list for the co-promoters was almost as long as the fighters. That's surely an encouraging sign for the sport moving forwards.
It definitely is, and it's amazing what a few dollars will do to soothe people's egos and sort of resolve certain rivalries. But I think there's danger in it too. And this is not anything negative about the Saudis, but the danger in the history of the sport has said, sometimes, people fall too hard into these opportunities. And, people are sitting around waiting for the magic phone call and become dependent on these opportunities instead of continuing to build a healthy ecosystem where there are opportunities at all levels, not just big events with big checks out of Saudi Arabia. So again, I don't want to get hooked on any particular thing. It's bad to get hooked on pay-per-view. It's bad to get hooked on money from one particular source. I think we need to have a variety of sources, a variety of distribution, variety of different sort of finance opportunities. And I think that's really what needs to happen now. I think, the question is, people going to flock to the shiny thing too much, become too dependent on it, and maybe create some other problems for the sport.
And obviously, history has also shown us in boxing that things do come to an end. I mean, I guess one of the concerns that I can say myself as a boxing fan is that when certain things are withdrawn from the sport, where does that leave people after that? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Is we become too dependent on those. Then I think one of I'll use a different analogy and not the Saudis, HBO and Showtime. I think we've all become dependent on what HBO and Showtime, the responsibilities they've assumed with infrastructure. Showtime had, a social media team of 8 or 9 people. There aren't any individual promoters that can afford to have a social media team of 8 or 9 people. So it's a great thing while it lasts, but as you point out, when that rug is pulled out from under you, how do you adjust and how do you get back to pounding the pavement and doing the things, the promoters doing those things and the fighters doing those things without sort of getting out of the habit of saying, well, the network's going to handle X, Y, and Z. I don't have to worry. Now, the networks are gone, largely, in terms of the traditional networks. So now it's sort of okay, now the onus is all back on all of us to figure out how do we continue to get exposure for the sport.
That sort of challenge, I mean, somebody even as experienced as you've been and kind of with as diverse a background as you've had, that challenge must be something that really is something quite exciting for you at this stage of your career.
It is. It is exciting and scary. Scary because the stakes are so high. We've seen, even in terms of, I don't want to get too macro. Sports media is changing. Sports sections in the newspapers are being cut. There's not as many sports writers. There are very, very few dedicated boxing reporters or journalists. Now that's not a bad thing because certainly a lot of YouTube-based and video-based and other sources have come up in between. But the reality is we've got to figure out how to navigate this new world because if we sit back, it is changing so quickly. It's going to leave us all behind, and all of a sudden we will become a true niche sport. Even more niche than we are already.
Obviously, without divulging too much of your grand plans, which I'm sure you do have, what are the short, medium, and long-term goals from a production point of view on the Amazon Prime PBC deal?
Well, the first goal, which we passed, was mounting a production in the first place, which sounds like I'm being a smartass. I'm not. It happened in a very short amount of time. From hiring talent to sourcing trucks to putting together. It's not the Showtime team. There are certain online talent that are. It's not Fox. It's a combination of some people from a lot of places and a lot of new people. So the first thing is making sure that Amazon, that platform worked, that the production worked, that we had a cohesive change. Now it's time to start perfecting it, and we did changes. And someone who has watched as closely as you, probably if you've seen the domestic telecast, or you could probably even see it in the world feed, we've made some changes. The pace is very different. We've got the pace of the fights. We made a concerted decision, to do less between fights and move it very quickly along. which, there are downsides and upsides to that, and we need to find the right balance. So I think, perfecting the production itself, getting the right amount of information and feature without bogging down the pace. I don't particularly like the UFC approach, which is sort of fight, and at some point they become sort of anonymous and generic because it happens so quickly, you don't really get to know anything about the fighter before you're getting in there. But I think there's improvements that can be made from the way Showtime did it. So from that perspective, I think in the long run, I think the goal is to emerge from this with a healthier sport overall. Now, that is not something that I or even PBC can single-handedly do, but I'm hoping as some of the generations turn over, we've got new people into the sport, that we get something that looks a little bit more cohesive, call me naive, and something which maybe is a little bit healthier all around.
Just on the PBC schedule, obviously there's been two events. Is the third. Invariably, as you know, very well know, Stephen, there'll be the naysayers. There's the people who are asking questions about this, that, and the other with regards to the schedule. Everything that we've discussed here is kind of like, what I really expected, which is, building something, and it is a new brand, as it were. Does the, trying to phrase this in a way that's do the haters piss you off, Stephen, when it comes to this sort of thing?
Sure, and you don't have to spend much time on my social media to see that. And
I'm a follower,
and I engage probably more than I should, and it's out of passion and impatience, and some would say thin skin that I do engage. But the reality is, if you had seen Showtime's first two events, it certainly wouldn't look at what it looked like 37 years later. So I think what people are looking at is saying, okay, this is quote unquote the replacement for Showtime, and it's not quite looking the same. It doesn't have the same pace or the same volume at this point. And look, I had hoped that people would give some time and some grace before drawing conclusions, but that's not unique to boxing. That's sort of the media industry and people today. Is they're going to make a snap judgment based on one or two events. I would ask people to give, just wait till the end of the year. Let us get a year under the belt and see what the schedule looks like, and then make all the criticisms you want. But I think at this point, it's very much a walk before you run process. Everyone's saying, no, not first three events have been pay-per-view. That doesn't mean all 12 to 14 are going to be pay-per-view in the first year. That is the exact opposite of what the initial announcement said. It will be a mix of both. And, in time, as we continue to walk before we run, the rest will fill out.
Let's talk about this fight, Canelo Alvarez versus Jaime Munguia. We spoke briefly off camera about a bit of a spicy final press conference yesterday, most notably between Canelo Alvarez and his old promoter, let's not be fancy, Oscar De La Hoya. A very spicy press conference and something that it seems has been bubbling up for quite a while between the pair.
Yeah, it seemed to be bubbled up and bubbled over at this point. My question comes from the timing of it, because we certainly didn't see this antagonism and animosity at the initial kickoff press conference. And so part of it makes me wonder, is this a calculated strategy by Oscar to create some distractions and get under Canelo's skin and maybe anger him, going forward? And that may or may not be true. But once he did that and the floodgates opened, clearly they both had a lot to get off their chest. And there was a lot that had needed to be said for a long time. And sort of it all came gushing out. And just when you thought it was sort of coming to an end, like it sparked up again. So, clearly there's a lot of water under the bridge. And I'm not sure if this is a ongoing thing. Maybe they both said their piece and got it off their chest and they're going to, go the other way. But something says that we haven't heard the last of this yet.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. Just on that, Canelo Alvarez, obviously, fight week, tensions running high, and that is a relationship that has certainly seen its ups and downs over the years, should we say. He did say some things that have caused a stir. A couple of homophobic remarks, obviously in your position as a very senior person on a broadcast. I know from my own experience with dealing with people in senior parts of the broadcast, that's not the type of thing that we want to be putting over as the advertisement for the sport.
It's true, and I certainly don't make an excuse for it. There's a different perception of that within the Mexican culture. I mean, it's been an ongoing issue in world football. In terms of some of the comments from the crowd, I'm not sure you're ever going to take that out of the Mexican culture. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, and I'm certainly not criticizing the culture. But it's been an ongoing. Those kinds of comments have said that. It's interesting. One of my concerns is, look, at the end of 37 years in the sport, and I hate to keep harping on that. You're starting with the Hagler through the Tyson years, through the Mayweather years, and beyond, and through the Broner years and others. The network developed a pretty thick skin. I mean, certainly there were times where things crossed their line and there were decisions made, but as a pay network, there was also a different level. We were not susceptible to advertiser influence. We had no advertisers. One of the things is like, this is a new platform, and it actually struck me during the March 30th fight, which was for fight fans, fantastic card, top to bottom. It was also, in my 20 plus years in the sport, the bloodiest fight I've ever seen, in television or in person, bar none. And on one hand, the fight fan is sort of, not that we look for that, but the action spoke for itself and the drama spoke for itself. My question is, oh my God, this is going to be the shortest run of a platform ever. We're losing gallons of blood. It looks like, Freddie versus Jason on the first fight on Prime Video. And I'm sure there were some that are squeamish, and that was not their response. But there are those kinds of considerations where you're going to a new platform.
Always an interesting process, welcoming people into this mad old sport, isn't it?
I think there were, I was joking with a couple of the Amazon executives about, their dry cleaning bills. If you saw, Abner afterwards, he was wearing a bright aqua blue suit that by the end of the day was speckled purple. And it was already speckled before we even got to the pay-per-view. It was, from the prelims. And then by the time we got to the main event, everybody was covered in blood by that point.
Appreciate you taking that question. I understand it's an awkward situation, particularly with a developing new platform. Just onto the fight itself. Canelo was very revved up. We don't usually see that from him. We've seen it in patches over recent years, the Caleb Plant incident and so on and so forth. Do you think that could be a help or a hindrance to him on Saturday night?
Look, after 60 fights, I think he's seen it all, and he certainly has the experience. I'd be surprised if he fell victim to that. But part of me went back to De La Hoya Mayweather, and Oscar has been very open about this, they went on the press tour and Floyd was needling and everything. He was stealing his food. He came out with the chicken with the gold medal around his neck. It was very funny, very calculated, and very effective. And Oscar has said afterwards that he came in still angry from 8 weeks earlier and tried to take Floyd's head off. And that played right into Floyd's hands strategically and probably altered the fight. So we see that even a fighter as experienced as Oscar has fallen victim to that. Could it happen to Canelo too? Sure, anything's possible. But I think there's a perception of Canelo based on what he allows to be seen. And he seems always very calm, cool, almost detached. That is very much that is something that he controls and projects. He has he's a very funny, very playful side. He does have a temper. He is a human being. He just doesn't allow us to see it very often. And here you saw a glimpse of the fact that, yes, he's very much an emotional person.
It's one of those it's catch-22s, isn't it, when we talk about, and particularly over recent years where boxing has become, in certain aspects, people are trying to make it a little bit more family-friendly. at its essence, these are fighters. These are quite often, caged animals for 12 weeks, and when they get to fight week and it's starting to get close to the weight, and things can happen, can't they?
I go back and forth on this internally.
It must be a difficult balance for you to strike in the production side of things, the broadcast.
It certainly is. I mean, even a simple decision of how much of that we replay during the telecast. And not just because of the content of the remarks, as you said, but now there's a potential defamation suit. There's all kinds of slurs. There's all kinds of this. Look, I do not want the sport to go down the road of other sports, which will remain nameless, where the more outrageous and offensive you are, the greater the financial remuneration that you get, the more opportunities you get. I never want this sport to go there. Now, that may sound somewhat funny from someone who's done Adrian Broner fights and has done Floyd Mayweather fights and done a variety of other things. But I'd like to think that we can promote the sport, do this. But at the same time, you don't want to neuter it and take away its essence, because it is at its essence it's a brutal sport. It is pure competition. It is very primal in very ways. So question, what is the right balance of that? And it's an ongoing discussion.
Of course, yesterday, not enough drama for one day. We, of course, were greeted by let's call it what it is, the really disappointing news about Ryan Garcia's 2 positive VADA tests. I know you've worked with Ryan in the past. I think everybody in this room, in some way, shape or form, has encountered him. Never a good thing for the sport when these things happen, particularly on the back of such a stunning performance in a big fight. Really disappointing news.
That's exactly how I would describe it. It goes without saying that if all of the tests come back positive, and it's
sure there's of course a due process that has to be followed.
All that, and the obvious thing is obviously no one thinks that has a place in the sport. But as you say, it is disappointing for the trajectory of the sport. And it's one of those situations where we've got we had a great fight card on May 30th, topped by that fantastic, dramatic Zoo Fundora fight. Then we had Ryan and Devin, a really entertaining fight, a lot of heart on both sides, massive upset, and then going into what should be a very action-packed, fight between Canelo and Munguia. And here we are, we've once again stumbled, at a point where we should be building momentum. And I think it's a disappointing part that we have gotten to the point where we once again stumble when we should be continuing to build.
Boxing has a wonderful way of shooting itself in the foot.
It is, and among the other details, I'm curious to see, because this is one of the rare opportunities where the positive test has coincided with a commission test. Usually you've got VADA or someone else catching somebody 6 weeks out, 2 weeks out. Here, I think we're going to see at least one example of how good are the commission tests, because we've got positives from VADA apparently on Friday and Saturday, and we have a commission test on Saturday. And look, it's hard to hold commissions to the same standard. They don't have the same resources. They're state funded, they're government funded. It's tough for them to keep up to the state of the art. But here we don't often get to see an A/B test. We know that these tests have come down positive in all likelihood, and it'll be interesting to see what comes back on the commission test, whether to detect it or not.
I mean, invariably, as we've mentioned already in this interview, everybody has their right to due process and to follow that. Were you surprised with kind of the way that Ryan was? It was very combative, very Ryan about things, considering everything over the last couple of months. It wasn't incongruous. The reaction was very much in keeping with what we've seen from him over recent months, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a question: was all of that calculated? Was it crazy like a fox? Nobody knows but Ryan and those closest to him. But I certainly didn't expect contrition and an apology or anything like that. No, he's taken it stride, just like he's taken everything else in stride. It's sort of like, from Trump to, Deion Sanders to positive test, and who knows what's coming next.
I'm sure there will be something, but let's wait and see what that is. Final thing from me, Stephen. Do appreciate your time. I want to talk to you about one of your old friends, Mike Tyson. is fighting again. He's fighting Jake Paul. Your thoughts on that, Stephen? As somebody who knows Mike and has worked with Mike for many, many years, your thoughts on the fight exhibition, the fight?
You know, Mike is nothing if not self-aware, and I think that's what people don't realize. You know, even in his most controversial moments, and he's in a much different place now, he's always been very self-aware, and that's why at this point, especially in the clarity that he has now about who he's been and who he is and where he places all in perspective, if he believes that he is, you know, in a position to be able to carry out this fight safely, I don't question that. That might sound strange for somebody who's, I believe, turning 58, you know, imminently. But he's been in and around the sport and has a keen level of self-awareness. If he thinks that 8 2-minute rounds with, you know, large gloves are something that physically he can handle, I trust him. You know, he has performed at the highest level for many years. You know, toward the end, he was very clear at the end of his career. He was absolutely transparent that his heart wasn't in it, and he wasn't motivated anymore. And I don't think that if he didn't feel passionate and excited about this opportunity, he wouldn't be doing it.
We all know that, we've mentioned it here, you know, fighters, you know, they're very unique, special individuals. And the flip side of that is, you know, saving fighters from themselves at times. And, you know, Mike is, you know, a very learned man, and as you mentioned there, kind of knows himself at this point, but he is still a 58-year-old man getting in the ring with a guy who's 30 years his junior. You mentioned those end of the fights at the end of his career, Kevin McBride, Danny Williams, of course, from our neck of the woods.
Right.
That was a long time ago. He competed at the top level for a long time. It's been a long time since he competed at the top level. As somebody, of course, you have the personal relationship with Mike, but from a business perspective, I think a lot of people watching this, one thing that we do not want to see is a 58-year-old man get knocked out. Mm-hmm. From your position in the broadcast, I'm sure you would have those professional feelings, if not personal feelings as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. What I feel differently, and this wasn't your question, I know, what I feel differently if I was responsible for the event itself. Maybe I would, and maybe that undoes everything that I just said. But, you know, and this is not a discount against Jake, but again, as much as Jake has grown as a fighter and learned and developed, he's still fighting somebody with, you know, the ring IQ and the instincts of a lifetime in the sport. So, yes, I think there's danger. I would say, yeah, you're going to do 1 8-round, 2-minute fight, sure. Would I want to see Mike doing this repeatedly? Absolutely not.
Okay, and before I let you go, wouldn't be right to not speak about a certain Gervonta Tank Davis. We're expecting his arrival. I think he might actually be around, but we're expecting him on Saturday.
Yes.
Of course, has his fight with Frank Martin booked in for the middle of June. Great to see Gervonta Davis back, and I'm sure from Amazon Prime's perspective and your perspective, great to have him.
Yeah, fantastic. You know, I think the sport is better when he's in it. He generates a lot of excitement. There's been some stops and starts and some legal issues and all that's behind him. And I think you can tell he's in fight mode already. You know, he's picking fights with everybody he runs across on social media. And that's how you know.
He's been looking at your Twitter too much, I think, Stephen.
And so he's certainly... you know, he's in a take no prisoners mold, which is sort of the mindset you want somebody in when they're going to camp.
With him, with this Amazon platform, with all of the potential that carries, how significant could this be for Tank's career? People talk about the deals that Floyd did when he did his deals with Showtime, of course, and you know, HBO prior to that. How big could the Gervonta Davis Amazon Prime partnership be?
Well, he because of his age, he is poised to be one of the biggest beneficiaries. If this Amazon Prime deal grows the audience like we believe it has the potential to, and creates commercial opportunities like we believe it can, he's the primary beneficiary. As one of the strongest pay-per-view performers, and at his age, he is in prime position to be the biggest beneficiary.
Okay, well, Stephen, thanks very much for your time. You're a very, very important, popular man around these parts, Stephen. I mentioned to you before we started. I stood there, waited very patiently for you, so I've kept you for far too long now.
I don't know if I'm not sure I would say important and popular. I'd say, look, there's a keen demand of interview subjects, and I happen to wander in at the right time.
But regardless of that, thank you very much for speaking to Boxing News. Always a pleasure to catch up. Hopefully we don't leave it as long next time, but thanks very much and we'll catch up soon.